Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and good morning. Thank you all for joining us today as we discuss some key geopolitical issues from our Political Risk Outlook 2020. My name is Micha Hribernik. I'm head of Asia here at Verisk Maplecroft, and I'll be moderating the webinar today from Singapore. Before we get into it, just an introduction to Verisk Maplecroft and a little bit of housekeeping. I think it's important to set the context of the political risk outlook before I begin. If the early 2000s were marked by the global war on terror, the 2010s by post-crisis economic recovery and the rise of populism, the 2020s, in our opinion, appear set to become the decade of rage, unrest, and shifting geopolitical sands. In this year's Political Risk Outlook, we will kick off by taking a forensic look at the upsurge in civil unrest. Then senior analysts from our Country Risk Insight team will explore some of the primary geopolitical issues affecting the key regions and players around the world. Before we get into that, for those who may not know us, here at Maplecroft, we believe in simplifying the complexities of managing political risk. By combining our world-leading data with expert analysis and advice, we equip our clients with the insight you need to make more effective decisions and target resources where most needed. Our specialist consultants and country risk analysis experts offer you the highest level of assurance. They work side by side with you to build a forensic picture of where, how, and why your global operation and investments are exposed across the full range of country risks, and provide a true 360-degree view of your organization's risk exposure in key markets. Now I would like to make you aware of a few housekeeping items. Firstly, your microphone is muted by default for the duration of the webinar. However, you can use the chat panel to send us questions at any time during the presentation. If you're viewing the webinar in full screen mode, you can see the chat function via the drop-down panel that is revealed when your mouse is at the top of your screen. Otherwise, it can be opened in the top right of your WebEx window or by clicking the blue dialog button. Please note that if you would like to ask questions anonymously, you must have just host and presenter selected in the drop-down box of recipients before sending your question. Otherwise, all the other participants will see the question and complete its prompt. Secondly, we will try to answer as many questions as possible with the time remaining at the end of the presentation. But if we do run out of time and we do not get to your question, we'll coordinate a follow-up response with you after the session. And finally, please don't worry about needing to take down lots of notes. The presentation slides and a recording of the webinar will be made available to you via email in the next few days. Just to note that due to the new GDPR regulation, if you have selected Do Not Email on any Maplecroft forms, unfortunately, we will not be able to send you the slides of today's presentation. You can change your settings, or you can get in touch with us directly at info@maplecroft.com if you would like to receive this. With that bit of housekeeping out of the way, I'm now delighted to introduce today's panelists. My colleagues Hugo Brennan, Niamh McBurney, Eileen Gavin, and Dara McDowell. Together, we'll unwrap three diverse issues from our political risk outlook. We'll be discussing an upsurge in civil unrest and the trends we see for 2020, the US-China trade war, and the Middle East. We also have a little bit of time at the end for a Q&A session on Latin America's role in the US-China trade war, as well as Russia's role in the extractive sector in Africa. So I'm going to kick things off by talking about civil unrest, which seems to dominate the news in the second half of 2019. I'll look at which countries experienced a surge in protests last year and then unpack the reasons why. After that, I'll look ahead and talk about where we can expect more protests to erupt in 2020. Now, based on our data that tracks the drivers, frequency, and severity of civil unrest, 47 jurisdictions witnessed a significant uptick in protests by the end of 2019. As you can see from this map, a diverse range of jurisdictions were affected, including Hong Kong, Chile, Nigeria, Sudan, Haiti, and Lebanon. This was really, for all intents and purposes, a global issue. Now, on the next slide, you can see how we've used our civil unrest index to see which countries experienced the biggest increase in protests last year. Now, for those of you less familiar with Verisk Maplecroft indices, just a brief explanation. So we assess countries for different risks and place them onto a scale between 0 and 10, where 0 is the highest possible risk and 10 the lowest possible risk. Now, in the chart on the screen, the horizontal axis shows by how much a jurisdiction's index score deteriorated across 2019. In other words, the further to the right a country is, the more civil unrest worsened across the year. On the other hand, the vertical axis shows our most recent assessment of civil unrest in each jurisdiction. In other words, the further to the top a country is, the greater the risk of civil unrest right now. You can very clearly see that Chile and Hong Kong both plummeted in the index rankings last year. In fact, Chile fell dramatically from being the 91st to the 6th riskiest country worldwide, and Hong Kong from 117th to 26th riskiest. Really, the only thing saving Hong Kong from dropping further in the index is that it still has some mechanisms in place for channeling discontent, which includes freedom of speech and a robust judiciary, although these are being increasingly eroded. This is in stark contrast with many of the extreme risk countries where no such mechanisms exist. However, in terms of the actual severity on the ground and the frequency of protests, Hong Kong definitely sits alongside Chile as the world's riskiest destination. Other hotspots include Nigeria, which ranks 8th riskiest worldwide, Lebanon in 13th place, and Bolivia in 21st place. And these countries recorded significant negative swings in the index as well. The number of countries with scores falling into the extreme risk category increased from 12 to 20 across the year, reflecting the growing and intensifying level of protests globally. These protests can have major impacts on the ability of businesses to function. For example, in Chile, the first month of unrest alone caused an estimated $4.6 worth of infrastructure damage and cost the Chilean economy around $3 billion, or 1.1% of its GDP. Of course, it's very important to know that no two protests are the same, and the reasons for growing anger, which is spilling into the streets, vary from country to country. Nevertheless, there are some issues that unite many of them. Our index, so this is the Civil Unrest Index, measures key factors such as the grievances of a sizable marginalized group, proposed or actual subsidy cuts, and inflation. And you see some of these visualized for some jurisdictions on this slide. We also measure the presence and effectiveness of mechanisms to manage discontent. For example, trade unions or civil society that can resolve issues nonviolently. In Hong Kong, a proposed law that would have allowed the extradition of criminal suspects to mainland China was the spark in June 2019 that has led to deaths and at times paralyzed the territory. However, the root cause and current fuel of the protest is the rollback of civil and political rights since the handover of Hong Kong from the United Kingdom to China in 1997. Now, in Chile, a seemingly trivial 30 peso increase in the price of the metro ticket, which is about 4 cents US dollars, unleashed protests about more fundamental issues revolving around income inequality and high living costs. In Bolivia, the cause of protest was very, very far from trivial, with the electoral fraud of the now resigned President Evo Morales bringing people into the streets. Subsidy cuts were the biggest drivers of unrest in Chile, Lebanon, and Zimbabwe, as shown on the visual here, with sudden fuel subsidy cuts in Iran sparking nationwide protests as well. Now that we know which factors drive unrest, we can start doing some predicting about the future risk of protest. Let's take a closer look at 2 examples. The first slide shows our civil unrest projection for Chile, which provides a forecast of up to 2 years into the future. We can very clearly see the major increase in unrest following the metro price hike in Santiago. We can also see that our baseline forecast, represented by the dashed line, is a minor reduction in unrest over the next 6 months, although we do allow for some uncertainty. This means that we don't expect the underlying causes of unrest in Chile to be addressed, although the demonstrations have succeeded in opening a constitutional revision process, which is set to last from this year through to 2023. Similarly, we see how our data recorded a massive spike in unrest after the Hong Kong government introduced the extradition bill last year. In our view, there's little prospect of a resolution unless the authorities give in to protesters' demands or if Beijing decides to send in the military. Both of these are outlier scenarios in our view. As you can see, according to our projections, this will most likely mean that protests continue over the next 2 years with only minor improvements likely by early 2022. And finally, let's zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture for this year. Our projections predict that 75 out of the 125 countries in our forecasting database will, on average, see an increase in civil unrest by the end of June 2020. The horizontal axis, this time around, shows how much we expect civil unrest to increase in individual countries. We project significant upticks in Guinea-Bissau, Ukraine, Argentina, Thailand, and Guatemala, to name a few. The vertical axis, on the other hand, shows where protesters are most at risk of human rights violations committed by security forces. Countries such as China, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Turkey are a few that stand out. This risk also extends to any company personnel that may find themselves anywhere in the vicinity of protests. Countries that perform poorly on both of these indices are the ones where we can expect to see an explosive mix of the use of violence by law enforcement, which in turn will radicalize protesters, provoke violent responses, and ultimately fuel further unrest. This is a risk in all of the countries that I've just mentioned. To sum all of this up, we believe 2019 is unlikely to be a flash of the pan in the pan. In our view, the rest of the year, potentially slightly longer, is likely to yield more of the same. And we believe that companies and investors will have to learn to adapt and live with this new normal. This concludes the first part of our presentation. So I'd like to turn now to our second topic, where my colleague Neve has been looking at America's changing priorities in the MENA region. Neve, over to you.
Thank you very much, Miha. In the Middle East, 2020 started quite unexpectedly with the killing of Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani in a US drone strike in Baghdad. But this highlighted something at Verisk Maplecroft we've seen developing through 2019, which is the changing relationship between the United States and key countries in the Middle East. All has not been well with the United States relationships in the region for quite some time. Each US administration of the 21st century has faced different challenges in the region which have progressively reduced its leverage. But what is different now under the Trump administration compared to its predecessors is how a quid pro quo agreed 75 years ago no longer holds any weight. The chart, thanks to data with our sister company Wood Mackenzie, reveals how sharply and how quickly the balance between oil supplies exported westwards and eastwards from the Middle East has shifted, in particular from Saudi to the US. Over the last decade, while unconventional exploration and production exploded in the lower 48, OPEC countries like Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates started redirecting their oil exports and increasing supplies to Asia and China in particular. Oil flows became again both a market indicator and a tool of foreign policy, and now for countries in the Middle East, not just the historic great powers of the world. For the Trump administration, this was increasingly untenable. For candidate Trump, bring our troops home was a rallying cry for saving money and protecting American lives that seemed to have no cost, which then became a key policy for President Trump. Let's take a step back to last year, 2019, and remind ourselves of just some of the incidents in the region. On the 12th of May, 4 oil and products tankers were attacked off the coast of Fujairah in the UAE. On the 14th of May, Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline carrying crude oil to the Red Sea was attacked by drones from Yemen. On the 20th of June, a US surveillance drone was shot down by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. On the 14th of September, Saudi Aramco oil processing facilities at Abqaiq and Khurais were attacked with drones and cruise missiles. None of these attacks apparently warranted an armed response by the United States. The current administration doesn't see the utility of supporting its allies in the Middle East, and we think this has receded in line with its diminishing reliance on oil, particularly from Saudi Arabia. It's increasingly hard to see what the US is for in the region rather than what it is just against. The White House is very reluctant to underwrite protection for oil production and shipping that fundamentally most benefits its biggest strategic rival, China. Counterterrorism initiatives don't hold the commanding narrative that they once did. But the Trump administration has not spelt out clearly what its interests in the region are, let alone having a plan to further those interests with their allies. All the events and more I listed earlier prove a contradiction, that the US is less willing to act in the region, but the might of the US military is very much still present. For all the fanfare of Trump announcing withdrawals at the end of 2018 and recent issues with the government in Iraq looking to remove the US troop presence there, troop numbers are still the same as under Barack Obama. But the basis on which the US military responds is now transactional, financial, singular. This is more about a crisis of confidence in a long-standing relationship by Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the UAE, and others. This makes the region much more fragile and much more prone to uncertainty. And ultimately, nothing frames that uncertainty in the region more than the discord between Iran and the US. It was the driver of insecurity in 2019 and is the backdrop for 2020 so far. So we ask the question, what are the chances of a major confrontation between the two powers? Now, on the left, you can see a graphic that shows our interstate conflict model, which tracks historic verbal conflict, military spending, bilateral trade, regime type, and then also how these factors can drive militarized conflict, and calculates based on all of these indicators the chances of the use of military force. For Iran, the model puts it at 78%, and this was calculated before the Baghdad drone strike on the 3rd of January. When we took into account other elements like historical precedent, domestic political pressure, and then elections for both sides this year, presidential election in the US in November, and then also parliamentary elections in Iran later in this month, we started asking a more specific question, as you can see on the right. And our judgment-based forecast methodology produced only a 35% chance of an American drone strike on Iranian territory or targets in international waters this year. The Qasem Soleimani strike signaled a change in the US relationship with the Middle East. The potential for direct military confrontation between the US and Iran continues to persist. And as we like to say, risks remain.
Thank you, Neve. Definitely a lot to consider here. Now I'd like to turn to the latest topic of our presentation and to my colleague Hugo, who will discuss how the corporate sector risks becoming a new front line in the rising strategic competition between America and China. Hugo, on to you.
Thanks, Miha, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our audience, wherever you might be in the world. So without further ado, let's take a look at the bilateral relationship that will define the 21st century. So as we can see in the chart on the slide, US-China relations are characterized by cycles of heightened geopolitical tensions, followed by periods of de-escalation. President Obama's second term saw bilateral tensions rise amid spats over the South China Sea, cyber espionage, before Trump's election ushered in a relative honeymoon period, bar one ill-judged comment about the status of Taiwan. The most prominent source of friction in the US-China relationship since the start of 2018 has, of course, been the trade war, and bilateral tensions have closely mapped the progress of these protracted trade negotiations over the last 2 years. In our view, the Phase 1 trade deal that the two sides signed in January 2020 is likely to prove only a temporary ceasefire. As the trend line on the chart illustrates, the long-term direction of travel is towards increasing geopolitical tensions between China and the US, reflecting the fact that we have entered a new era defined by strategic competition and more adversarial bilateral relations. On to the next slide. So, as we can see in the map below, the US-China bilateral relationship has multiple friction points beyond the economic issues that have been front and center in the trade war, which will fuel increasing strategic competition between Beijing and Washington over the year ahead and far beyond. So if we just whiz around the map at some of these friction points, we can start in Xinjiang. So the US Congress looks set to pass legislation calling for tough sanctions against China for Beijing's treatment of its Muslim Uyghur population in Western Xinjiang region. And next up, we have the South China Sea. So the US will continue to engage in freedom of navigation operations in these contested waters. And this is a practice that riles Beijing and poses a direct challenge to China's bid for regional supremacy. Next up, we have Taiwan. So President Tsai Ing-wen won a landslide election victory on the 11th of January 2020 on a pledge to defend the self-governing island's sovereignty from Beijing. Her re-election ensures that cross-strait relations will remain tense and a potential flashpoint in US-China relations. Next, Hong Kong. So voters will elect a new legislative council in September 2020, which will very simply pit the US-backed pro-democracy movement against the Beijing-backed authorities. And then finally, we have the South Pacific. So US-China rivalry in the South Pacific is likely to heat up in 2020 as Beijing seeks to expand its influence within the so-called second island chain. The fact that we have entered an era defined by strategic competition between the US and China will likely serve as a significant source of geopolitical risk for companies and investors. Indeed, the corporate sector is on the front line, and individual companies risk becoming pawns in this geopolitical confrontation. While the market impacts of increasing US-China rivalry will vary considerably across sectors, we thought it was worth highlighting a few pertinent examples. So if we begin with the technology sector, one trend we see is narrowing opportunities for US firms in China over the next decade as Beijing doubles down on its push towards greater tech self-sufficiency, which is encapsulated by the Made in China 2025 industrial policy, to secure China's position as a global leader across 10 strategic sectors. Another thing worth highlighting is that US firms will have to navigate tighter restrictions when supplying high-tech components to Chinese firms, as Washington attempts to stymie the rise of China's tech giants. For the metals and mining sector, one trend that we think is important to highlight is that we see increasing US-China rivalry as creating new opportunities for non-Chinese miners, as Washington seeks to bolster the supply security of 35 critical minerals that is identified. At 35 minerals that the Trump administration has identified as critical and is seeking to reduce the US dependence on China as a source for these metals. Next up, the oil and gas sector. So while Beijing will likely ramp up purchases of US crude oil and LNG in pursuit of the trade targets included in the Phase 1 trade deal, these volumes will be highly susceptible to geopolitical headwinds the next time bilateral relations sour. And then finally, for all sectors, US companies and indeed firms from countries perceived to side with Washington in this geopolitical struggle will be exposed to Beijing's so-called qualitative measures during periods of heightened geopolitical tensions. And these will include things like politicized regulatory probes, state-backed consumer boycotts, and discriminatory import restrictions. One signpost to watch on this front would be if China goes ahead and establishes an unreliable entity list in 2020, as it is threatened to do. This would formalize Beijing's currently ad hoc means of punishing foreign corporates for the perceived transgressions, and those of their home governments. And then finally, obviously, when looking at US-China relations, we have a key inflection point this year with the US presidential election. So our what-if question is, well, what happens if Trump loses the presidential election in November? So we currently put the chances of Trump winning re-election in November at 50-50. Now, on the surface, that may seem like fence sitting, but actually we have a team of, I think, 4 forecasters looking at this question. And within those 4 individuals, there is a high degree of divergence, and the 50-50 is a consensus view. We'll be tracking this right up until election day. Trump has received a post-impeachment bump in the polls, but we still expect a tight race. While we do not yet know who Trump will face off against, it is fair to say that a victory would not necessarily, democratic victory, would not necessarily alter the fundamental trajectory of US-China relations. Leading contenders for the Democratic nomination, such as Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders, have all expressed support for a tougher line against China on issues such as Xinjiang and Hong Kong. The key takeaway to end on is that a trend of increasing strategic competition between the US and China both predates and will likely outlast the Trump presidency. That's it for this chapter, so back to you, Miha.
Thank you very much, Hugo, for a really interesting presentation. We now still have quite a bit of time to turn to some of the questions that have come in during the presentation. And actually, this is an excellent segue from Hugo's presentation because we have a question looking at the role of Latin America in the US-China trade war and what will happen if China bails out the struggling Argentine economy. So this is a perfect question for Eileen. So the question reads, at this point, do you believe it's feasible for Argentina to tap into Chinese funding in order to solve its debt situation, either in full or partially?
Thank you, Miha. Research shows that China has in fact become the world's largest official creditor, and political alignment does seem to frame its lending decisions, which would suggest that Argentina would be a potential candidate for a bailout. Having said that, 15% of Chinese loans to Latin America today actually have a commodity-backed clause, such as loans for oil and purchase requirements. And unlike the World Bank or the IDB, loans from China's policy banks don't tend to come with conditions for economic or political reforms. Again, that would suggest that it would be a suitable candidate for some Argentina assistance. However, given China's economic slowdown, China doesn't seem to be in a position at this moment to act as a lender to Argentina. It's also the case that President Alberto Fernandez appears to be looking to do a deal within the Western Hemisphere financial system. And so at this moment, we don't see China as a potential lender for Argentina. We can't rule out Chinese investment on the ground, again, in mining or oil and gas, but we don't see it as a potential direct loan lender at the moment. Thank you, Miha.
Thanks, Eileen. Okay, let me jump back into the question pile. The next one is for Dara. So one of the other issues that we've covered in the political risk outlook is Russia's role in the extractive sector. And so this question is perfect for you. It reads, are Russian NOCs getting preferential access to oil and gas concessions as a result of Wagner support for African governments?
Afternoon, good morning all. That's a very good question. So far, we haven't seen actually any activity from official Russian oil companies or the NOCs like Rosneft or quasi-NOCs like Lukoil or all that. What we've seen so far is primarily it's been in the mineral rather than hydrocarbon extractive sector. So, for instance, in more oil-rich regions like Libya, despite the presence of Wagner forces, we haven't seen much in the way of even preliminary commercial agreements over Libya's oil fields. There's been more of a focus on things like platinum group metals, bauxite, cobalt components for next generation technologies, electric batteries, and that sort of stuff. One of the quasi-exceptions to this is Mozambique, where Russia does have some commercial interest in the development of the country's natural gas reserves and LNG projects there. But primarily, we haven't seen the same kind of political and business alliance between Russian NOCs and the government, as we've seen in places such as Kurdistan and Venezuela. Rather, and for example, CAR, what we've tended to see is Wagner or other PMC deployments accompanied by mineral concessions being granted to relatively obscure offshore companies linked to key Russian individuals. And then those Wagner forces being involved not only in security roles, but providing the logistical capability to exploit and monetize these mineral resources in conflict regions. So that'll be something to keep an eye on, and something to be an indicator that the Russian commitment in Africa, which we currently regard as being quite shallow and not terribly well rooted, is stepping up to another level if we start seeing the Rosnefts and the Lukoils and the very big oil companies start to get involved. But it's not something we've seen just yet.
Thank you, Dara. I see we still have a couple more questions, and I'm pretty sure the next one's for me, so I'm gonna pick that one up. So it reads, do you expect governments to be more effective in preventing or suppressing protests this year? That's a really good question, right? We've seen countries, I mean, all of the countries I've listed in my presentation, scramble to find some kind of a solution. And most have responded really with, a combination of repression and token concessions that didn't really work. Now, in our view, yes, this is a learning experience, right? Governments adapt, security forces adapt, as do protesters as well. So while on one hand, governments are certainly better prepared in 2020, we still don't believe they'll be significantly more effective. Hence our rather gloomy predictions for this year. And so why? Well, simply put, right, some of the grievances that I listed earlier, right, some of the structural factors are very deeply embedded in the economy, in the political system, right? Things like income inequality, poor governance, the loss of trust in established political elites, the lack of a civil society of mechanisms to encourage dialogue. These are things that even if governments were to kind of scramble and find a solution with all of the resources at our disposal, these things take time to address. These things could take decades to address, right? So we certainly believe, at least in 2020 and a fair bit beyond that, we don't expect a radical solution or a major change here. And so we certainly see widespread protests continuing, and that's why we call them, they're the new normal. Right, and companies, rather than sort of wait to ride this out, will start to really have to think about ways of adapting to this new normal. We have two more questions, and I think we have enough time to answer both of them. So the next one is for Niamh. In your view, what's next for the Iran nuclear deal in 2020? What do you think? Hi, Niamh. We may have lost you.
Thank you very much. Yes, so that's the billion-dollar question for the Middle East this year. You know, with the elections I mentioned before, you know, especially as a number of us have referred to the presidential election, it's really going to be a make or break year for the nuclear agreement between, you know, Iran and you know, the US and European powers and other allies. Iran is losing as much as $4 billion in revenue a month due to the sort of combined US energy sanctions. A rough estimate is $1 billion for every 500,000 barrels of oil and condensates it can't export. So really, Tehran is just trying to hold out for another candidate to win other than Trump at the end of this year. And as Hugo laid out, one of our forecasts and the forecast on the election at the moment, we're 50-50 on whether Trump will win or not. Obviously, once we have clarity on who the Democratic candidate is he'll be fighting against, that will become clearer. I will say in the region, the view is not optimistic at all. There is an assumption that Trump will win and that they will have to deal with President Trump for another 4 years and also deal with the consequences of you know, US policy in the region for another 4 years and really likely beyond, because, you know, that'll have ramifications for quite a while. I mean, there are still risks that the deal will collapse entirely. You know, Iran's been downgrading its compliance in sort of structured steps. It did so again recently. And, you know, the other element to this as well is that if Iranian sort of those steps continue, the UK, Germany, and France in particular are really going to struggle to keep the deal alive. They've entered the sort of negotiating, the pre-agreed negotiating structure that was built into the deal, but that was put in the deal as a fail-safe mechanism that was never designed to be used, and now they're having to use it. So it really makes it quite, I'm going to say quite really very challenging to see where we go from here positively. So yeah, unfortunately not optimistic on that front.
Thank you, Niamh. Let's pick up one more question. Hugo, this one's for you. How likely is it that the phase one deal that the US and China recently concluded will unravel? What's your take?
Thanks, Mena. It's a good question. It's certainly one we've been thinking about a lot since it was first announced in December and then signed in January. I think our view is that it will unravel eventually. So at this current moment, a ceasefire in the kind of US-China trade war and a wider confrontation that I outlined earlier suits both sides at this point in time. So Trump is obviously very focused on securing re-election, and he has made the economy the kind of central plank of his re-election bid, as we saw in his State of the Union address yesterday. So anything that eases or mitigates any potential risk to the US economy will likely have his support, and the phase one trade deal does this. Similarly, Beijing is satisfied with the phase one trade deal as it stands because it gives it breathing room to deal with its own slowing economy, and of course, more recently, the fallout from the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan, which is unsurprisingly has rocketed up to the top of Beijing's priority list, getting this outbreak under control. But taking a kind of longer term view, the purchase targets included in the phase one trade deal are pretty unrealistic in our view. So, for example, if we take achieving the punchy targets to expand energy purchases seems pretty unlikely, given that tariffs on US crude oil and LNG remain in place. Beijing has not indicated that it would reduce these tariffs, and it was also clear in the phase one deal, the kind of propaganda that came out afterwards, that sort of market purchases would be made based on commercial considerations. It's hard to see how you would buy say, US LNG when it had a 25% tariff on it, therefore making it uncompetitive for Chinese buyers. Current state and time. So I think our view is that the Phase 1 trade deal is certainly not a silver bullet that will reverse a long-term trend towards greater US-China rivalry, and it will likely, how long it holds will depend on the status of US-China relations. As we said, we think over the short term it suits both sides, but longer term can definitely see it unravel.
Thanks, Hugo. Right, this has been a very interesting webinar. We've covered a lot of ground. Hope everyone found it as interesting as we did doing the research and the analysis and now presenting to all of you. I think this brings us to the end of today's session. If you have any more questions, please get in touch with us. We're more than happy to send a few thoughts your way, schedule a call, anything like that. We'll also be following up with all of you with a copy of the Political Risk Outlook and the recording of this webinar. Also, just to note, we'll be presenting on these same topics later today on an accommodating time for our colleagues in the Americas. So if you want to share this information, you can direct them to the News and Events section on our website, which is www.maplecroft.com. Finally, I'd like to say a thank you to Hugo, Neve, Dara, and Eileen. And thank you all for joining us for this session, and have a wonderful day.